Hello Worldview 2 students, this is your teacher Jonathan Swirsky. We are now going to do The Prince lecture, The Prince by Niccolò Machiavelli. Niccolò Machiavelli's background is that of an Italian noble. He lived in Italy during the 1500s. Now, Italy during the 1500s, at this time in history, was composed of a lot of smaller city-states, places like Florence, Genoa, and Venice. And although this led to the cultural renaissance that happened that made art, music, architecture, and many other things flourish, it also led to a lot of political infighting, unfortunately. The Greek city-states would often fight each other over petty things like land, wealth, or political power. This was the Italy at this time in history in the 1500s. On May 6, 1527, Rome was destroyed. Charles V, the leader of the Holy Roman Empire, came with 20,000 mercenaries against the 4,000 defenders of Rome. Once the battle was over, the mercenaries pillaged many of Rome's treasures, including precious artwork that they sometimes melted down for the gold or silver that was within them. It was left behind a lifeless shell. Machiavelli wanted to write a book to warn Italy of such events like this. And unfortunately, or fortunately depending on your view, most people did not listen to him. It was in this war that Machiavelli died. He was in a previous war in which he was tortured on the rack. He wrote a book after he was released from this previous war called The Prince. It is a book that describes how to save Italy. Unfortunately, or again, fortunately, his advice was not followed, and therefore his legacy was not something that happened during his own lifetime. He was only famous after his book was published, and after his death, of course. He wrote it to show how to defend Italy. Now, there are many opinions about Machiavelli. The negatives: he was cunning, ruthless, immoral. He was called the devil incarnate. Positives: he wrote the book to expose evil. And although part of his argument is advocating for a temporary dictator, he did not want this dictatorship to be permanent. He did want to return to the glories that Rome had previously had, especially the Roman Republic. So he can be viewed largely as a man who had a good goal, but was willing to do anything evil to get to that goal. The ends justified the means to Machiavelli. He basically saw three options for Italy. You could do one of three things. You could either save the country through appointing a dictator. You could accomplish justice, but then Italy would be weaker. Or you could have mercy on the inhabitants and simply try to go on as you had while not being cruel. But he said you could not do all three of these things. You could have justice and mercy, or you could have justice and save the country, but you could not save the country, have justice, and have mercy. A ruler could only do one, maybe two of these things. Again, save the country, have justice accomplished, or be merciful to his people. And as a result of this, you've probably already picked up, he thought that the best way to do this was to appoint a single ruler in order to save Italy. Now, he knew that the Italian nobles would not go along with this because each of them would want to rule Italy. So he saw the best way to accomplish this as basically to have a person come along and slowly gain power in Italy through any means necessary, including political backstabbing, assassinations, what have you. His opinion on the nature of man is very interesting. He said that he personally himself said that there was no sin but ignorance. I want you to think, what other philosopher, especially ancient Greek philosopher, wink wink, thought this same thing? He also thought that the rights of man were of no consequence when the country was in danger. So if you think about the current status of our country and the things that, the constitutional violations that have occurred through the NSA and Homeland Security, he would wholeheartedly approve of those if they were done in order to save the country. But what's your opinion on that? That's one of the questions we'll be discussing in class. Does a danger justify violating a man's rights or not? What do you think? The Renaissance Italy at this time was divided into 5 major powers. In the north, you had the Duchy of Milan, which was actually claimed by France. You then had the Republic of Venice, which very much wanted to conquer the other city-states. Then in the central portion of Italy, you had the Republic of Florence, which also wanted to conquer the other city-states. And then you had the Papal States, the states that were owned by the Pope. And at this point, remember, the Pope's power is somewhat declined but of course they still are trying to exert control over civil governments, and they still had considerable power in Italy. In the south, there was the Kingdom of Naples. France also claimed this. So not only was there infighting in Italy, France also came in and tried to take over a lot of Italy itself. So those five major powers often fought each other, and they really had no problem finding just the simplest excuse for war. They basically decided they were going to declare war on petty things just in order to take control of the other city-states. Machiavelli had no problem with this. He thought that slaughter was okay if it was done in order to unify the Italian city-states. This might be a very similar situation to the American Civil War, in which Lincoln thought that war was okay in order to accomplish preserving the Union. Now, obviously, he was not quite as politically motivated and ruthless as Machiavelli, but it's interesting to note the similarities. As you're going to study in Worldview 3, Lincoln was willing to suspend the rights of some in order to preserve the Union. Machiavelli also thought that this was okay. So do you think that Machiavelli and Lincoln are similar, or are there a lot of differences between the two? That's another question we'll talk about in class. A ruler's main job, according to Machiavelli, was war and the preparation for war. He said the art of war is all that is expected of a ruler. He thought that this was the primary job. So you can very quickly see why he thought that it was necessary for one person to control Italy. He basically wrote The Prince in order to show how to take over Italy. So he basically said that we're going to show you how to rule countries and maintain power. So how to gain power? Well, he had a few different ways of doing this. It really depended on what kind of ruler you were. If you already were an established ruler, he thought that was easier. For instance, if you were born into royalty or you had already acquired it, well, you were a leg up. If you were not already a ruler and you wanted to become one, he said that this was much harder, that new rule is an uphill battle. But if it was just a continuation of rule, well, then you could keep away any threat of power and simply gain and gain. But if you are the revolutionary, if you are the one that is the new ruler, then there are new expectations of you. And a prince must impose new rule which makes others hate him. So for instance, if you are coming in as a new ruler, you're going to have to come in and establish some harsh policies very quickly. But if you're an existing ruler, you have a lot more to work with. And this is an important distinction because he doesn't really say, oh, well, this portion of Italy should conquer the others. He's basically saying whoever is the strongest should conquer the others. This is very similar to survival of the fittest, if you'll notice. Now, he didn't say that the people were unimportant. In fact, he said you have to have the support of the inhabitants. But he thought you could do this a couple of different ways. He thought that you could do this through fear, or you could do this through love. There were different factors of power that Machiavelli considered. Two that we're going to talk about are fortune and virtue. Fortune are the circumstances outside of human control. For instance, weather, when you are planning to fight. Will it rain? Will it thunder? You aren't sure, especially back then. So these are things that are outside of his control. Also, how the people will respond, how other nations will respond, how other city-states will respond. But then you have the realm of virtue. Basically, this is the willpower of the ruler. These are circumstances that are in human control. He likened fortune to a river. It can be seen and guided, but not really controlled. Whereas virtue is something that can be controlled. And so as a result of this, again, he's saying the key to a successful rule is not simply treating your people nicely, it is subjugating them. He did admit that you could do this through love, but he thought it was much better to be feared rather than to be loved. He said that you have to see change coming. You cannot simply stay where you are. You have to be able to adapt to what's happening. The key to a successful rule, according to Machiavelli, is flexibility in all things, and this includes morals. We stated earlier he was considered amoral, meaning he had no morals. This is absolutely true. His goal was to defend Italy, and he was willing to do whatever it took to make that happen. He also had a big deal, he wrote a lot rather, about public versus private life. He thought your public life should appear noble and just to the people. They should be able to have trust in their ruler, even if he is a harsh ruler. But he said your private life really doesn't matter. It doesn't have to line up with who you are in public. So this is a question for you. Do public and private lives have anything to do with each other in the life of a politician or a public figure? Or can they remain separate? as long as the public figure appears moral, well, then is he really harming the kingdom? What do you think? Honesty is something that is also not important to Machiavelli at all. He thought that it was okay to lie, to cheat, to do whatever you had to do to accomplish your goal. And again, it's a noble goal, protecting Italy, but an ends justifies the means argument is what dictators all throughout history have used. And we already touched on this, but he wondered, would it be better to be feared or to be loved? According to Machiavelli, he thought it would be better to be feared. Because if you are feared, you have the ability to command, to be obeyed. If you are loved, well, if you change your policies, then the people will change along with that. Machiavelli had a very strange view of human nature. How would you contrast that human nature with Christ's human nature? It's one of the questions we'll be talking about as well. According to Machiavelli, the prince is above the law. The law is not above the prince. Do you think that this was similar to what was going on in medieval Europe in the 1500s? Or do you think that in most countries the law was above the prince? And how did that look going forward? In America, in the early founding, was the law above the prince or was the prince above the law? What was that like in England during the House of Tudor and the House of Stuart? The prince was very influential on future rulers, and we're going to be talking about that more in class. Make sure to get all the notes for this and rewatch it if you need to. Thanks. Bye.